Hello everyone, this is Robert, and in this video I'm going to be making some large wind chimes out of fence posts that you can get at like Home Depot or Lowe's. They're relatively inexpensive, but you can actually get some pretty decent sound out of them. And when I first kind of had the concept for making some wind chimes, I didn't realize how complicated they are, so hence the video. There's actually quite a bit to learn and, tuning them and getting them all situated properly. So I'm going to kind of cover most of the basics in this video and at least point you to the resources to where you can figure out how to make your very own wind chimes. But the fence posts work really well because you can get a really decent sound out of a pretty inexpensive piece of material. Yeah. So when I first started this project, I thought that making wind chimes was going to be really straightforward. I was just going to, go get some aluminum or some tubing and just cut it down to size, kind of eyeball it hanging from a string, and that was going to be it. But it's really not that simple or straightforward. Ultimately, what you're creating is a musical instrument, and the better you make it and the better you tune it, the better it's going to sound. So if you have, 5 or 6 wind chimes, each one of those chimes needs to be in a chord progression and it needs to match the others, and it's a whole thing, and you need to pay attention to the material and the length, and it's just a thing. Thankfully, I didn't have to learn any of this on my own. I found this website made by Lee Height, and there is a link below, and I'm going to be relying on that website for most of the heavy lifting and explaining how all of this stuff comes together. But what I didn't realize is that you can ultimately tune the wind chime for heavier wind speeds, lower wind speeds, louder, quieter, all sorts of different things. So most of the choices that I made are based on the resources that I found on Lee Height's website. So let's get into kind of some of the basics that I'm going to be using to make my own wind chimes. So let's start by talking about the actual chimes. For what I wanted to do, I wanted something that was a little bit more lower frequency. I didn't want the, high twinkly kind of chime. I wanted something a little bit lower and had a little bit more depth. And that means I'm going to need something a lot larger. The larger it is, the lower the frequency is going to be. Ultimately, material doesn't really matter. I did look at like aluminum, copper, and all sorts of other things, and in the end you can kind of tune any material to be whatever frequency you want to be, with some caveats. So the material choice really comes down to what you can find and if you can find it in the appropriate sizes. So I ended up with these fence posts because you can get a 6-foot long section of this at, I think I went to Home Depot, it was like $11 for a 6-foot section. You can also end up doing like conduit or other things like that. It's just a really cheap way to get a large size scale of material. And, like I said before, the material really doesn't matter. You can still get a good tone out of them as long as you spend some time and spend some attention into tuning them. So this next step I think is kind of one of the hardest. You actually need to pick the notes, and then you need to pick the sizes for those notes. Depending on the material, depending on the thickness, all that good stuff, that's going to determine how long each one of these needs to be to determine the notes. I have a spreadsheet attached in the description of this video where you can see what I did, but I ended up taking 3 6-foot long fence posts and cutting them down into 6 individual pieces, and those ended up being an ACE, ACE, and that allowed me to do 6 chimes with very minimal waste. So I'm a really bad YouTuber and I didn't show any of the process of cutting these down to size. I do have footage of the tuning, but this is what these 6 posts will look like after you cut them. And this is the amount of waste that I ended up with, very, very minimal waste. When you cut these, you can use a bandsaw, you can use a hacksaw, whatever you have on hand, but doing this by hand is perfectly fine. You just want to make sure that you cut these a little bit longer. What we're going to do is cut them long, and then you're going to shave them down to actually tune them into the exact frequency. The reason we do that is because these don't have a consistent wall thickness. They actually do have, a seam right there, so it's a little bit thicker along that seam. You're just not going to be able to cut these to exactly the length that you need and expect them to be at the right frequency. The other thing that you need to do to prepare these is drill a hole straight through for mounting. If you look on the Lee Height website, you can find just an infinite number of mounting options, and I'll get into the option that I ended up picking, but you're going to need some kind of hole that goes straight through, and this hole needs to be placed pretty accurately. If you look at my spreadsheet that I made, the distance from here to here I think is like 22 point something% down, and so that is going to vary for each piece. As you can see on this big one, we have the hole that far away, and on that one it's only that far away. So this distance is actually critical how you mount it. Yeah, let's get to tuning these things. So tuning each chime is a relatively straightforward process. So each one of these we want to be a specific note and therefore a specific frequency. So what we're going to do is we're just going to hold it up in the air, strike the bottom of it, see what frequency or what note it resonates at, and then make it shorter with a belt sander, and then rinse and repeat. Now, you might end up doing this about 20 times per chime, so this can take a couple hours. I think it took about maybe 3 hours altogether to do all of these chimes. It is really a little bit of a guess and check method. Now, how we're determining the frequency is we're using just a cell phone app. I had one on my phone, my wife had a different one on her phone. I don't really have a link to any of them. There's a million free ones. Just go to the Play Store, the iOS Store, or whatever, and just download one. All we're just trying to do is figuring out what frequency it should be ringing at, and then checking that against what the phone says. Something to keep in mind when you're tuning these much larger, lower frequency chimes. When you have your frequency analyzer or whatever it is on your phone, you're going to see a peak. That peak is going to be the thing that you're going to be tuning against. That is the frequency that your chime is ringing at. When you start getting into the longer ones, like this one is 43 inches, we're supposed to be hitting a fundamental frequency about 220 hertz. Well, the lower frequencies have a lot less energy in them, and they're going to dissipate very quickly. So you're going to have the phone either very close up to it, or you're going to have to strike it a few times, and you're also going to have to enable the app to have multiple fundamentals on there. So you might have one peak here, one peak there, and one peak there, and you're just going to have to know which frequency you are looking for. For instance, if I strike this, this should be about 222 hertz, which is a pretty low mid-bass tone, but you'll hear it as much different. So you hear a little bit of the low end, but then you also hear another note I think is like 580 hertz, and the phone is going to pick up both of those. So you just have to pay attention to that fundamental, but then also all the overtones as well. You're just tuning to that one fundamental. So if you spend the time getting everything tuned right, you will end up having 6 chimes that are very complementary to one another and sound really nice together. Wind chimes. Our neighbors are gonna love us. This is actually pretty heavy. So now that we have all of the chimes tuned, let's talk about how we're going to fit all of this together into an actual wind chime. The thing I didn't mention earlier was how I'm actually attaching the string or the braided cable that I have. I've just got a little 3D printed piece on the inside, so let me show you how that works. We've got a set screw there and a set screw there. For the final version, these are going to be thread locked, so these don't come out. But all I have to do is screw this in, flip it around, screw it in as well. This was really nice for tuning. And then I can just slide this out. And it's just a little 3D printed piece that has brass inserts on each one of these lobes. So when I screw out the set screws, it just holds onto their like little ears. And then I just have a cable with a ferrule running through the middle. So I know it's just kind of a little bit of overthinking it, but it does work well. So now that all of the chimes are tuned and have wires run through them, it's time to hang them on the top plate. The top plate is 3D printed as well. It's made out of PETG, which is a plastic that can withstand UV and heat, so it's perfectly suitable for outdoor use. I'll get a better close-up of this later and kind of explain how it works, but it's just a matter of taking all 6 chimes, threading the wire through, screwing it down, and that's about it. So here is what the 3D printed top piece looks like. You see I've got this U-bolt in the top. That is the hanger. I can just use a chain with like an S-hook. I made it so that the nuts actually recess down into the plastic, I don't know, just for like a cleaner look. It runs through the whole thing, and then there's nuts on the back side with washers. So that is what is securely holding this, and that's what it obviously hangs from. I did this because the striker mechanism hangs down from this, and when that hangs down, I didn't want it attached to this point. I wanted it kind of, more in the structure in the body of this. So the actual striker just hangs from a little eyelet that screws into the underside of that. So that gives me one hole in the center for the striker, and then this better mounting point for actually hanging this whole assembly. For hanging the actual chimes, you can see I've got these 6 little nodes along the outside. The wire kind of comes in, feeds through, then back out, and is held in place with a screw. Here is kind of a better look at how that works. So you're just gonna, feed the wire from the back side like that, and then feed it through. And then you just have a spot for a screw right there, and that will hold that in place and kind of squish down the cable, make sure it doesn't move. And I found that to work out pretty good. A little bit of overkill. There's this additional hole right there, and you can see that all of these are recessed. I have just a little 3D printed cap, so you can just kind of finagle that around and place a cap in there, and then you don't really see it. And the hole goes all the way through, so I can kind of push it out from the backside if I want to. So yeah, that is how the hanger system works. Once again, this is just 3D printed, just kind of as a prototype. I will probably eventually switch this out for a different material, but just kind of testing things out for right now. So I've got them all mounted on the top plate, but what I didn't realize is they're all different weights, so that top plate isn't sitting flat. So what I'm gonna do is rearrange these so that it sits flat and the weight is more evenly distributed. But they do sound pretty nice. So yeah, let me redistribute that weight and we'll try this again. So I finally got these all mounted up. Everything is level, everything is good, and this little wind catcher dealy is at the bottom. But there is one bit of a problem. You want to hit these at the bottom as much as you can. You don't really want to hit them in the dead middle because there's a bit of a dead zone and they sound different. So if we look at this longest one, if I hit it in the middle, it sounds like that. But if I hit at the bottom, it sounds like that. I don't know how much that's going to show up on camera, but at the low end, it sounds much more full and rich. But when you hit this in the middle, it kind of sounds a little ringy and weird. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to adjust the height of these so that this really short one comes down lower. I'm going to take the striker and move it down and basically just shift everything down a little bit. So I'm hitting this one further towards the bottom as much as I can. So I'm almost done with this thing. I've got all the lengths adjusted. The last steps are to reprint this striker as PETG, so it's black and it matches everything else. I've got to cut off the excess wires at the top. All the adjusting is done, and I'm going to go and Loctite everything. I'm not really sure at this point if I'm going to do any finishing with the actual fence posts themselves. I might run them on the bench grinder and just kind of clean them up a little bit, but we will see. So I'm going to get a new one of these printed, get everything Loctite, get everything trimmed up, and then I'll hang it up outside and we'll see how it sounds. But it's sounding really good right now. And here they are mounted underneath the deck. Right above this, we actually have a sectional and a fire pit. So we're actually sitting out here quite a bit. So it's kind of nice to have them right below you so that you can hear them. the sound itself doesn't really travel that far outside of our property, so I think everything is kind of tuned up well there. I'm going to kind of live with these for a little bit and see what changes and modifications I want to make. The 3D printed pieces should hold up long enough, but ultimately the goal is to possibly machine it out of aluminum, use some wood, you know, maybe paint the chimes, just kind of clean it up a little bit and dress it up a little bit. But for right now, I think everything works the way I want it to, and they sound fantastic. So yeah, overall pretty happy that you can use a 3D printer and some cheap fence posts from Home Depot to make some reasonably nice sounding chimes. Thanks for watching. Check me out on Facebook for any updates to my channel, and I'll see you in the next video.